June 4th, 1943, Camp Hearne, Texas. The spoon shook slightly in Unteroffizier Wilhelm Hoffman's hand as he gazed at the tray before him. Beef stew with thick, tender chunks of real meat. Fresh vegetables, crisp and bright instead of the half-rotten scraps he was used to. A slice of white bread that smelled of actual wheat rather than sawdust. And beside it all, a glass of chilled milk, gleaming in the hot Texas sunlight like something out of a dream. "This cannot be real," he muttered, later writing the same words in a letter that would not reach his mother in bombed-out Hamburg for another 6 months. "They're showing us a trick. Propaganda food. Tomorrow it will be turnip water again, like always." Around him, nearly 1,900 German prisoners of war from Rommel's defeated Afrika Korps sat in the cavernous mess hall, stunned into silence. Men who had once fought on half rations of black bread padded with wood fiber and thin beet-water soup now stared at portions large enough to keep a Wehrmacht squad alive for days. The metallic clatter of forks faded. Some prisoners began to cry. Others sat motionless, paralyzed by the abundance before them. A reality that contradicted 3 years of Nazi propaganda about a starving, broken America. What they were actually seeing was something very different. The industrial and agricultural muscle of a nation that produced more food than it could consume. Even while supplying 12 million soldiers and shipping 17 million tons of food aid to its allies, the United States still had surplus. And this meal was only the beginning. To grasp the psychological shock, one must first understand the depths of deprivation these men carried with them. By 1943, the German rationing system had collapsed into a strict hierarchy of hunger. Civilians scraped by on 1,700 calories a day, when supplies even existed. Soldiers were officially promised over 3,500, but frontline men rarely received half. In North Africa, where most of these prisoners were captured, conditions were catastrophic. Feldwebel Wehrmuller of the 21st Panzer Division kept a diary. His final entry dated May 11th, 1943. Division rations today: 150 grams black bread, mostly wood pulp, 15 grams rancid margarine, a bowl of soup made from 1 potato and desert weeds. Italians are starving. We eat our horses. By surrender, the once proud Afrika Korps were gaunt skeletons, suffering from scurvy, beriberi, and protein deficiency, diseases German doctors had not seen since the First World War. Medical officer Oberleutnant Friedrich Bauer recorded, "The men's gums bleed constantly. 30% suffer night blindness. Edema swells their legs. We are an army of walking skeletons." When 275,000 Axis troops laid down arms in Tunisia on May 13, 1943, among them stood some of Germany's finest soldiers, men who had crushed France and driven Britain to the sea. They had been taught to see America as decadent and weak. The first cracks in that belief came immediately. At makeshift collection points, American quartermasters handed out C and K rations. Soldiers who had survived months on horse meat and moldy bread opened small cardboard boxes filled with crackers, tins of meat, chocolate, sugar, even cigarettes. One prisoner wrote, "The Americans apologized this was all they had." Apologized. Then came the voyage across the Atlantic on Liberty ships. Mass-produced transports launched faster than German intelligence had thought possible. On board, prisoners witnessed a casual wastefulness that defied their reality. American sailors tossed whole loaves of bread into the garbage, complained about eating chicken too often, stamped on melted chocolate bars rather than salvage them. Starving Germans scrambled in the trash for scraps. Disembarking at Norfolk, Virginia, August 1943, the culture shock deepened. Dockworkers, many of them women and African Americans, groups Nazi propaganda had labeled inferior, labored skillfully while eating thick meat sandwiches, sipping Coca-Cola, smoking, and discarding half-finished cigarettes. Prisoners undergoing medical intake exams were given something unthinkable: vitamin tablets to heal their starved bodies. The train ride inland was an even greater revelation. Through Virginia's Shenandoah Valley, they pressed faces to glass, staring at orchards heavy with fruit, endless cornfields, herds of fat cattle, grocery stores bursting with food, restaurants boasting daily specials, and ice cream parlors with lines stretching out the door. By war's end, the U.S. camp system would house over 425,000 German prisoners across 700 facilities in 46 states. Texas alone held 50,000. Camp Hearne, built in just 4 months, boasted electric lighting, hot showers, flush toilets, recreation halls, and above all, 3 hot meals a day. The menu from June 5, 1943 survives in camp records. Breakfast: oatmeal with milk and sugar, scrambled eggs, bacon, buttered toast with jam, coffee with cream, orange juice. Lunch: vegetable soup, roast pork with gravy, mashed potatoes, carrots, bread, apple pie milk. Dinner: fried chicken, rice, green beans, cornbread, fruit salad, coffee. One day's rations, 3,500 calories, exceeded what German civilians consumed in 2. The meat alone outstripped their entire monthly allowance back home. Oberstfreiter Hermann Richter wrote, "I ate until I was sick. Then I hatte more." Many had bread in their bunks, convinced it would end tomorrow. The guards laughed and said, "It will be the same tomorrow and the day after." We did not believe them, but it was true, and that truth shattered every certainty these men had carried across the ocean. They had been promised an America of decay and poverty. Instead, they found themselves eating better in captivity than as soldiers of the Reich. And no propaganda leaflet or radio broadcast could have struck as deeply as that simple, undeniable fact. America's abundance was real. Even our own officials cannot buy ice cream, one German prisoner wrote home. Yet here, enemies purchase it for 5 cents. The shock was not only the ice cream itself, but what it represented. An America so abundant that it could hand out luxuries to the very men who had been sent to destroy it. Cocoa, sugar, milk, even chocolate were given to captives as though these items were common water. For malnourished Germans, the therapeutic feeding programs were equally astonishing. Prisoners received vitamin injections, dietary supplements, and specialized meals designed to reverse years of deficiency diseases. The camp hospitals themselves resembled miracles. They were stocked with more medicine than most German field hospitals had seen in years. Here, penicillin, the miracle drug Germany could not produce, was administered freely for simple infections. Dr. Heinrich Schmidt, a captured Wehrmacht physician, recalled, "They gave us bottles of vitamins, hundreds of pills like candy." In Germany, we had none for our wounded. Here, enemy prisoners received better medical care than German civilians could dream of. By late 1943, America's growing labor shortage placed POWs directly into the fields, factories, and food processing plants of the United States. What they saw there completed the demolition of Nazi ideology. At a cotton gin near Houston, Germans watched machines harvest at a speed no human army of laborers could match, one machine doing the work of 50 men. The gin itself processed more cotton in a single day than German mills did in a month. Yet what struck the prisoners most was the casual abundance of food eaten by the workers themselves. African-American laborers, people whom Nazi propaganda had labeled subhuman, sat down to lunches of thick ham sandwiches, fresh apples, slices of pie, and thermoses of coffee with real cream. Half-eaten meals were discarded without thought. Unteroffizier Johann Kellner, assigned to a Mississippi farm, wrote in disbelief, "Negro workers eat meat every day, white bread, fruit." One threw away an apple with a bruise. In Germany, people would fight for that apple. In California, POWs were sent to canneries where trainloads of peaches rolled in daily. The Del Monte plant they witnessed processed more fruit in one day than Germany imported in an entire year. Workers drank orange juice like water. Tons of blemished fruit were dumped or destroyed simply to stabilize market prices. Nothing shocked the Germans more than American meat consumption. While civilians back home struggled on 250 grams of meat per week, and soldiers rarely received their promised rations, POWs in the U.S. were served beef, pork, or chicken 2 and sometimes 3 times a day. At Camp Shelby, Mississippi, which housed over 5,000 prisoners, the kitchens burned through 14,000 pounds of meat each week. The camp butcher cut steaks and ground hamburger as casually as if it were endless. Oberstfreiter Paul Fischer confessed in a letter, "For Sunday dinner, we had roast beef, a slab as thick as my thumb." The Americans complained it was tough. In Germany, this would be meat for a wedding feast. My children have never seen such meat. At Swift & Company's massive plant in Fort Worth, POW laborers saw cattle processed at a scale that dwarfed anything in Europe, 5,000 head per day. Workers carried home packages of beef that would have cost a German laborer a month's pay. The waste alone stunned the prisoners. Fatty cuts and trimmings, treasures in a starving Germany, were discarded without hesitation. As one prisoner wrote, "This one plant produces more meat in a week than Bavaria sees in a year." Even greater was the impact of fresh produce. For years, German diets have been reduced to sauerkraut, dried beans, and pickled roots. In American camps, crates of fruit arrived daily. Apples, peaches, pears, grapes, even bananas. Oranges were handed out at breakfast, not for holidays, not for rations, but daily. Within weeks, prisoners' bleeding gums from scurvy healed. Unteroffizier Wilhelm Becker admitted, "We ate more fruit as prisoners than German children will see in a year." Vegetables appeared in dizzying variety: lettuce, corn, beans, carrots, squash, onions, potatoes. At Camp Hearne alone, a 50-acre vegetable garden, worked by the prisoners themselves, overflowed with produce. Those transferred to California's Central Valley stood in orchards that stretched farther than the eye could see, horrified as entire loads of fruit were discarded for minor blemishes. The greatest cultural earthquake, however, came with the sudden return of sugar and chocolate. In Germany, chocolate had vanished by 1941, replaced by ersatz bars made of acorns and beet syrup. Real sugar was rationed to 200 grams per month. Yet in American POW camps, shelves of the post-exchange overflowed with Hershey's, Baby Ruth, Snickers, Milky Way, brands that would become legendary among returning prisoners. Oberstfreiter Kurt Wagner marveled, "I bought 5 chocolate bars with one day's wages." In Germany, all the money in the world cannot buy one real chocolate bar. What kind of wealth allows enemies to buy chocolate daily? Camp kitchens baked pies, cakes, cookies, and puddings almost daily. Sugar was used without hesitation in cereal, coffee, and desserts. Dairy was equally abundant: fresh milk, butter, cheese, cream. At Camp Hearne, the local dairy delivered 500 gallons of milk every single day. For men who had not tasted real milk in years, the experience was overwhelming. Unteroffizier Franz Weber wrote, "I drank a full glass of cold milk today. Real milk, not powdered, not condensed. It tasted like peace, like childhood, like everything we had lost." Even coffee, a staple of German culture reduced at home to bitter acorn substitutes, was available in endless supply. Real Brazilian beans brewed strong and refilled at will, with cream and sugar. Headman Friedrich Timman summed it up, "The Americans drink coffee all day long." In Germany, my mother stretches 50 grams of substitute to last a month. Here, coffee flows like water. Oberstfreiter Kurt Wagner marveled, "I bought 5 chocolate bars with one day's wages." In Germany, all the money in the world cannot buy one real chocolate bar. What kind of wealth allows enemies to buy chocolate daily? Camp kitchens baked pies, cakes, cookies, and puddings almost daily. Sugar was used without hesitation in cereal, coffee, and desserts. Dairy was equally abundant: fresh milk, butter, cheese, cream. At Camp Hearne, the local dairy delivered 500 gallons of milk every single day. For men who had not tasted real milk in years, the experience was overwhelming. Unteroffizier Franz Weber wrote, "I drank a full glass of cold milk today. Real milk, not powdered, not condensed. It tasted like peace, like childhood, like everything we had lost." Even coffee, a staple of German culture reduced at home to bitter acorn substitutes, was available in endless supply. Real Brazilian beans brewed strong and refilled at will, with cream and sugar. Headman Friedrich Timman summed it up, "The Americans drink coffee all day long." In Germany, my mother stretches 50 grams of substitute to last a month. Here, coffee flows like water. And finally, there was bread, the soul of the German table. By 1943, German bread was a heavy, dark mixture of rye, potato flour, and sawdust, rationed to just 2 kilos a week and often moldy. In American camps, soft white bread appeared at every meal, delivered fresh from camp bakeries. At Camp Shelby alone, 10,000 loaves were baked each week. For the Germans, this daily abundance was not just nourishment. It was proof. Proof that the Reich's propaganda was a lie. Proof that America was not weak, starving, or decadent, but an engine of wealth and plenty beyond anything Europe had imagined. Soft white wheat bread, the kind Germans once considered a luxury reserved only for the wealthy, was suddenly placed before prisoners in America. They could eat as much as they wished. One astonished prisoner, Paul Schmidt, wrote in disbelief, "The bread here is soft as cake, baked fresh every day. We can take as many slices as we want." In Germany, people are killed for stealing a single loaf. The reality inside the camps became a dangerous truth for Germany's censors. Prisoners were allowed to write letters home, and in those letters lay a devastating contradiction. How could families surviving on watery turnip soup possibly understand that their captured husbands and sons were being served meat 3 times a day? Many prisoners, gripped by guilt, softened their words. They could not bring themselves to tell starving families about overflowing tables. Others tried to make amends by sending their entire wages home, money that could buy food on the black market far beyond what ration card allowed. One intercepted letter from Karl Hoffmann to his wife revealed the crushing secret. "My beloved Greta, do not worry for me. I am well fed here. The Americans have more food than they know what to do with. Now I understand why they fight. They're defending paradise." What stunned German officers even more than the abundance was America's astonishing flexibility. Prisoners with medical conditions were given personalized diets. Diabetics received sugar-free meals. Those with stomach ulcers were provided bland foods. The care exceeded what German hospitals could give their own wounded soldiers. And to ease homesickness, the Americans even procured rye flour for dark bread, sauerkraut, and other familiar tastes of home. Dr. Wilhelm Braun, the senior German medical officer at Camp Shelby, admitted bitterly, "The Americans devote more effort to feeding enemy prisoners than the Wehrmacht gives to its own men." As more prisoners worked on American farms, their eyes opened to a new world of agriculture. They witnessed crop rotation, chemical fertilizers, mechanized farming, and large-scale irrigation. In Kansas, writer Hermann Weber was stunned. One farmer with machinery worked 640 acres, land that would have required an entire German village. His combine harvested 100 acres of wheat in a single day. That farmer alone produced more food than my entire district in Bavaria. He did it with machines, chemicals, and methods we had never imagined. Then came Thanksgiving, November 25th, 1943. Most prisoners had never heard of the holiday, but abundance needed no translation. That day, Camp Hearne served roast turkey with stuffing, mashed potatoes and gravy, sweet potatoes topped with marshmallows, green bean casserole, cranberry sauce, soft rolls with butter, pumpkin pie, apple pie, coffee, and milk. Each plate contained more food than a German family would see in a week. The turkey alone outweighed an entire month's meat ration in Germany. Sergeant Kurt Zimmerman wrote home in awe. The Americans celebrated by feeding enemy prisoners like royalty. If every American family eats this way, then America is not a country, it is paradise. Soon, prisoners working in factories witnessed the industrial side of America's food miracle. At the Campbell Soup Plant in Camden, New Jersey, they saw 10 million cans of soup rolling off assembly lines every year. Automated peelers, continuous cookers, vacuum sealers, technology beyond imagination. What shocked them most was quality control. Pallets of canned food rejected simply because a label was crooked. In Germany, that waste exceeded entire factories' production. Then came the symbol of ultimate indulgence, ice cream. In wartime Germany, ice cream had vanished even for the wealthy. In America, it was routine. At Camp Shelby, a machine produced 50 gallons daily in summer. Prisoners could buy bars and cones at the canteen for pocket change. Writer Hans Meyer confessed in a letter, "Today, I ate chocolate ice cream. In Germany, such a thing is unimaginable even for the rich. Here, prisoners of war buy it as if it were nothing." The health transformation was extraordinary. Within 3 months of arrival, most prisoners gained 25 to 30 pounds. Malnutrition vanished. Scurvy, night blindness, protein edema, all gone. Major Robert Harrison, chief medical officer at Camp Shelby, reported, "The Germans arrived looking like concentration camp victims, emaciated, diseased, mentally broken by starvation. After 3 months of proper nutrition, they were healthy young men again." Prisoners themselves were shocked by the faces in the mirror. Muscles returned, energy surged, and the fog of hunger lifted. Yet with recovery came guilt. How could they feast while their families starved under bombing raids? One unsent letter from Paul Fisher, found after the war, read, "My dear wife, I cannot tell you the truth. I eat meat every day while you starve. I am safe while you are bombed. The Americans treat me better than our own government treats you." Christmas 1943 deepened the wound. American church groups, the Red Cross, and local communities sent 500,000 Christmas packages to German POWs. Each held chocolates, cookies, canned goods, cigarettes, scarves, and cards hand-drawn by children. The generosity was distributed equally, with no regard for rank or ideology. Prisoner Werner Klein wrote in disbelief, "The families of the men we were trying to kill sent us gifts. American churches prayed for us. Children wished us a Merry Christmas. Only those certain of victory can afford to show such charity." By early 1944, food itself had become an education system. Prisoners learned about vitamins, balanced diets, soil chemistry, and crop science. Camp libraries stocked American farming journals and cookbooks. They discovered that abundance was not luck, but the result of research, machines, and organization. Former agricultural student Friedrich Becker summarized it. "The Americans have turned farming into science. They test soil, breed stronger crops, and use chemistry to multiply harvests. No wonder they have so much food." As 1944 dragged on and letters from Germany spoke of bombed cities and families surviving on grass soup, the contrast was unbearable. German ideology shattered. How could the so-called master race starve while their enemies wasted food? Some prisoners noted bitterly that even black camp workers eating from the garbage had more than German officers. Nazism, for many, died not on the battlefield, but in the mess halls of American prison camps. In the summer of 1944, German prisoners discovered another shocking sight: orchards heavy with fruit. In Georgia peach farms, they watched mountains of ripe peaches sorted by size and perfection. The flawless ones were packed for shipment. Slightly blemished fruit went to canneries. Those too soft for sale were discarded or fed to pigs. Prisoner Wilhelm Hoffman could hardly believe it. "We gave pigs thousands of peaches today. Perfect fruit thrown to swine." In Germany, people would have wept over each one. The psychological impact deepened that July when local farmers donated truckloads of watermelons for the 4th of July celebrations. For many Germans, the fruit was completely unknown. They stared at the giant green spheres in confusion, not even knowing how to eat them. When they sliced into the crimson flesh, sweet juice dripping down their chins, some men wept. Prisoner Carl Schmidt captured the shock in his diary. "They gave us enormous green fruits filled with sweet red flesh. Each one could have fed a family. The Americans ate the centers and tossed the rest aside. A nation that can waste food for celebration has already won." In the cornfields of Iowa, the scale of American abundance became overwhelming. Iowa alone produced more corn than all of Germany harvested of every grain combined. Yet much of this bounty wasn't even eaten by humans. It was fed to animals. To Germans, the idea of growing food to fatten pigs and cattle was unimaginable extravagance. Prisoner Hermann Fischer wrote, The farmer explained the corn was mostly for livestock. They grow food to feed to animals, just to make meat. The Americans have so much grain, they can afford to convert it into flesh. In Colorado, sugar production defied belief. Germany rationed civilians to 200 grams per month, but at a single Colorado plant, prisoners saw 5,000 tons of sugar beets processed daily. Mountains of white sugar piled up, workers scooping it casually into bags. Prisoner Paul Weber was stunned. I watched a man pour half a cup of sugar into his coffee. That was 2 months of German sugar rations dissolved into a single cup. At Gulf Coast ports, they saw American fishing fleets hauling in catches larger than Germany's entire industry. Shrimp boats dumped tons of bycatch, fish perfectly edible, discarded simply because it wasn't the desired species. Hans Muller wrote with disbelief, "They threw back more fish in a day than Germany catches in a week. In my homeland, people fight over fish heads, yet here they cast abundance into the sea." Wisconsin dairy farms delivered another shock. Mechanical milkers, refrigerated tanks, pasteurization equipment, all decades ahead of German methods. Single farms produced thousands of gallons of milk daily. Excess milk was poured onto fields as fertilizer. Prisoner Fritz Wagner could only write, "This farm produces 1,000 gallons of milk a day. They dump what isn't fresh. They pour milk onto the ground." In Germany, whole cities are starving for it. On a Maryland egg farm, the scale was staggering. 50,000 hens laid 40,000 eggs daily, gathered and sorted by machines. Germans, rationed to perhaps 1 egg a week, were dumbfounded. Prisoner Wilhelm Becker wrote, "Each hen house here holds more birds than my entire village. They throw away more cracked eggs each morning than Germany produces in a month." Thanksgiving of 1944 surpassed even the feast of the previous year. Despite America fighting on 2 fronts, prisoners sat before tables heavy with turkey, ham, roast beef, stuffing, mashed potatoes, corn, green beans, cranberry sauce, pies, ice cream, wine, coffee, and milk. Outside, German cities burned. Inside, the enemy dined like kings. Prisoner Vera Muller summed it up bitterly. "The Americans have so much food, they feed enemies better than we ever fed ourselves in peacetime. They conquered us with abundance before their armies ever arrived." By late 1944, many prisoners stopped writing about food. The guilt was too crushing. Hidden diaries revealed unbearable thoughts. Otto Schmidt's Klippblättern an Unsendletter. "I dreamed of sending you a single American meal. The meat for my lunch could feed you for a week. I live in paradise while you starve in hell." As 1945 dawned, the contrast became surreal. They ate bacon at breakfast, while newspapers reported German children boiling grass for soup. They sat in heated mess halls while their families froze in the ruins of cities. Prisoner Hans Fischer wrote, "Today I ate eggs and bacon. In the paper, I saw a picture of children with swollen bellies from hunger. My little Klaus is eating grass while I eat meat." On May 8, 1945, when Germany surrendered, prisoners in America faced a cruel irony. Freedom meant return to a nation of rubble and starvation. Many dreaded release. The U.S. military tried to prepare them. Camps introduced training in farming, food preservation, and nutrition. Rations were gradually reduced to ease men back toward scarcity. Dr. Wilhelm Hoffmann wrote, "Their stomachs have expanded. If they return directly to German rations, some may die. We must teach them to starve again." Before departure, each camp hosted farewell dinners. At Camp Shelby in February 1946, the menu was unimaginable. Shrimp cocktail, prime rib, lobster tail, baked potatoes with butter and sour cream, asparagus, Caesar salad, chocolate cake, ice cream, wine, and coffee. Men wept openly, not from joy, but from grief, knowing it was their last taste of paradise. Prisoner Friedrich Müller wrote, "Our final American meal was finer than any feast in Germany. Tomorrow we return to turnip soup and sawdust bread. America sends us home with full bellies and broken hearts." The journey back was devastating. Trains crossing into Germany revealed a wasteland, cities flattened, civilians skeletal, children begging for food at stations. At Frankfurt, prisoners watched women and children fighting over scraps from Allied garbage. The paradise of abundance was gone. When the war finally ended and the prisoners were released, many returned to Germany with a strange burden. They stepped off the trains into a homeland reduced to rubble, where gaunt civilians fought over scraps of garbage and children begged for food with swollen bellies. For men who had spent years in American camps, this was a brutal shock. They were too healthy, too well-fed, too different from their starving families. One former prisoner confessed in his diary, "My wife thought I was an imposter. I looked nothing like the broken men returning from the ruins. I was round-faced strong. My son, born while I was gone, had rickets from hunger. The shame was unbearable." Yet, despite the trauma, these men carried something priceless back with them: knowledge. They had seen American farming, food processing, and storage systems. They understood that abundance was not a myth, not propaganda, but a reality that could be built through science, machines, and efficiency. Many former POWs became leaders in rebuilding German agriculture. They introduced mechanization, fertilizers, and preservation techniques they had first encountered while working on American farms. As one former officer wrote, "In American fields, we learned lessons German schools never taught, that science and democracy create abundance." When the Marshall Plan was announced in 1947, these men understood it better than anyone. They knew America had the power to rebuild Europe because they had seen its surplus firsthand. Wheat, milk powder, canned goods, the same food they had eaten as prisoners now returned to Germany as aid for an entire nation. To them, this was not abstract policy, but living proof of what they had already experienced. Psychological studies in the 1950s revealed a striking difference. German soldiers captured by America were far more supportive of democracy and cooperation than those captured by other powers. The reason was simple: food. They had been belly-washed, not brainwashed. Every meal contradicted Nazi propaganda. Every plate of meat, every glass of milk, every scoop of ice cream was an unspoken lesson that prosperity came not from conquest, but from productivity. By the 1960s and 70s, as these men aged, they wrote memoirs and gave testimony. Almost all of them highlighted food as the most life-changing part of captivity. One recalled, "The Americans defeated us with food before their armies arrived. Every meal was a reminder of their strength." Another said, "I learned more about America from its dining table than from its books." In the 1980s, reunions began. Former German POWs returned to the sites of their captivity, now schools, warehouses, or open fields. They met their former guards as old men rather than enemies. At a 1985 reunion in Camp Shelby, one ex-prisoner raised a toast. "You fed us when we were your enemies. You showed us abundance when we knew only hunger." We carried those lessons back to Germany. By the 1990s, as the last great reunions took place, the memory had transformed into something almost spiritual. At the 50th anniversary gathering in 1995, an 89-year-old former POW addressed the crowd. "We came to America as warriors of the master race, certain of victory. We left as humbled men who had eaten from democracy's table. The Americans showed us strength, not in their weapons, but in their wheat. Not in their armies, but in their agriculture. Not in their ideology, but in their ice cream. Yes, ice cream. That impossible luxury that American children licked daily while German children starved. We returned home knowing abundance was possible because we had tasted it. We learned that democracy worked because we had digested its fruits. To those who fed us when we were enemies, you conquered us with kindness. You defeated us with donuts. You converted us with coffee and cream. We left as witnesses to your abundance." The hall erupted in applause. Former enemies, American guards, German soldiers, and their families stood together, united by the memory of how hatred dissolved in the face of hospitality. The story of German prisoners in America remains one of history's strangest victories, a conquest not through bombs or propaganda, but through bread, butter, and a generosity. They came believing in German superiority, yet they departed carrying the memory of American prosperity. They entered the wire as enemies, but walked out as men already leaning toward future allies. The food in America's prison camps did more than keep them alive. It dismantled illusions. Every generous portion weakened Nazi lies. Every slice of pie shattered propaganda. Every glass of milk washed away the myth of American weakness. These men were not conquered by hunger or cruelty, but by abundance, by kindness, by a daily lesson in prosperity too overwhelming to ignore. In the end, America's most devastating weapons were not the atomic bomb or the Sherman tank. They were apple pie and chocolate bars, beefsteaks and butter, milk and ice cream. German prisoners found themselves defeated by desserts, disarmed by vegetables, and conquered by coffee and cream. They had expected to find a weak, divided America teetering on collapse. Instead, they discovered an agricultural giant capable of feeding its own population and its prisoners better than Germany had ever managed for its own people. They did not just witness the arsenal of democracy, they tasted its abundance. The transformation was profound and irreversible. These men returned to Germany not simply as defeated soldiers, but as witnesses to possibility. They had eaten the future, and it was plentiful. They became advocates for abundance, apostles of prosperity, missionaries of what democracy could create. Their story reminds us that some of history's greatest victories are not won on the battlefield, but in the mess hall, not through destruction, but through generosity. Not by breaking bodies, but by filling bellies. The German soldiers who once marched for the Reich returned home with full stomachs and changed minds. They carried with them the quiet realization that democracy's strength did not lie in its power to destroy, but in its capacity to provide. They had arrived hungry, and they left not only fed, but transformed. In that transformation lay the foundation of a new world. The Marshall Plan, the Atlantic Alliance, and a Germany rebuilt on prosperity rather than conquest. Men who once believed in racial destiny returned as witnesses to agricultural science and industrial abundance. They had tasted America, and nothing would ever be the same again.